you very much. This is probably the shortest distance I've ever had to travel to speak at a conference. I've spoken at several this year, and it's great to only walk about 20 yards to get to the platform. In summary, I guess what I'm going to say, you can sum up in the posters we have at Ruskin, and this is the trade union poster. You'll be familiar that Ruskin was founded by the labour movement, and we still have very strong links with the labour movement and the trade union movement. And this simply says, unions start with you. And I think that's really, in summary, what I'm going to say, that really if we want a better social work, we need to do something about it, because it is about us. It's about what we do, and how we can shape the world around us at both a local level and also nationally as well. I've been teaching at Ruskin for about 10 years now, and prior to that I spent 20 years in social work, primarily in mental health social work, and mainly in London. And my research interest continues to be the views of frontline social workers and service users, and how we can learn from those experiences. So I might touch on some of that today. So I'm doing some research at the moment about frontline social workers in England and Scotland, and what I'm seeing actually, although there are differences, there are also lots of similarities as well, and I think we can definitely learn from that. So I'm also here to speak on behalf of the Social Work Action Network, which some of you may be familiar with. We're an organisation that was set up about 10 years ago. And we were set up after the tragic death of baby Peter Connolly, and in particular the response of the tabloid media, which attempted to scapegoat social workers and blame social workers. In fact, what was interesting about that episode was it was only social workers who received any blame for what happened. It seemed that everyone else managed to sort of get off the hook. But Swan was set up essentially to give a voice for frontline social workers who were fed up with being scapegoated when things go wrong, and generally didn't feel that we had a voice. There's lots of great organisations, but what we felt we needed was something that was not just about representing the views of social workers, but more so a group that looked more at how we could get involved, how we could campaign. And so Swan, from its inception really, has been about campaigning, both at local level and at national level. In fact, we've had a number of successes linking up with many other organisations, service use organisations. I mean, one very particular group I think have been very effective, DPAC, Disabled People Against Cuts, who are, I think, are outstanding in what they do. They've been involved in several successful campaigns. They've spoken at Ruskin several times, and they are an absolute inspiration. But I think that when we talk about social work, we really need to understand something that in education we take for granted, and that is that education is contested. Social work is contested. There is no such thing as the social work view. There have always been social work views. And I guess what I'm really saying is that all of us are influenced by ideology or by ideologies. Whether we acknowledge that or not, those ideologies, those influences shape how we think about the world and how we engage with that world. And in fact, that's a key thing we teach at Ruskin when we teach social work students. The first thing we say to them is there are competing perspectives on social work, as there are competing perspectives on the world and on society. It's really for you to make your mind up about which perspective best provides a framework for you to make sense of that society. And we desperately need frameworks to make sense of society and social work. And I think the other thing that's really, really important is that when we do that, we look beyond social work. Because although I'm a very passionate social worker, I'm as passionate about social work as I was when I did my CQSW back in the 1980s. I've never believed that social work in and of itself has all the answers. And in fact, the Swan tradition, the radical social work tradition, believes that social work benefits from a whole range of campaigns and social movements, going right back to the Chartist movement in Britain in the 19th century, which founded the trade unions, right up to present day. In fact, it was interesting listening to the debate around the EU, because you would have thought that the EU had given us all of our rights, all of our civil rights. Well, in fact, when you look at the evidence, what has created our rights in Britain have been ordinary people, have been campaigners, whether that's the LGBT community, whether it's been women campaigning for equal rights, the workers at Dagenham, women workers at Dagenham, that influence, their campaign influenced the equality pay legislation. What we've seen time and time again is when people come together, they can change the world, they can change the world around them. And that often starts in very small groups, but those small groups can grow. And I think social work really is about looking more broadly, about not just what we do as a profession, important though that is, but really looking more broadly to make sense of the world. And there are two people in particular who have influenced me in my thinking as a social worker, and they are Stan Cohen, who people will be familiar with his classic book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics. I think that one book explains everything we've seen in the last 3 months around the EU debate. And also Bob Holman, who did something rather exceptional actually. He was an academic, he was a professor of social work at Bath University, and he gave that all up to go and work in the poorest district in Britain, in an area in Glasgow called Easterhouse. And he wrote this great book. If you've not read Bob Holman's books, you need to read them. They are absolutely fantastic. But there's one book in particular which he edited in the late 1990s, and it was simply entitled Faith in the Poor. And that one book for me sums up really what social work should be about. It should be about looking at the very people we work with, learning from them and trying to make a better world for them and for the rest of society. Stan Cohen also said, he had a great quote where he referred to, he was a frontline social worker before he was an academic, and he famously said that I'm a campaigner in the evening and at weekends to make my day job that much easier. He recognised the link between social work and wider society, and I think that one example for me has been so important. That if we want a better world, we can't just assume that someone else is going to give it to us. We have to go out and campaign for that. That leads me on really to talk about some of the key themes and some of the key sort of threats I think that we face at the moment. From the Swan perspective, we believe that our value base as social workers very much shapes how we see the world. And I think it's really important as social workers that I've always thought this as a practitioner, that what I do as a practitioner is open to negotiation. I worked in some of the earlier community mental health teams where we worked alongside health professionals, and actually what I found was that health professionals have a lot in common with what social workers do, contrary to what some of the social work literature says about that. But there are also differences. And one of the fundamental differences, I believe, is that our starting point is our value base. And I believe as social workers, our value base should be non-negotiable. That really should be about how we see the world and how we act on that value base. What I do, I'll negotiate. If it's, helping someone claim benefits, or if it's taking on a new task in a team, I'm happy to negotiate that. What I'm not going to negotiate is my anti-racism, is my anti-sexism, and my anti-homophobia. They are what makes me, they're non-negotiable, whether I'm at work or in my private life. But I think actually one of the best definitions, I hope you can read the bottom of this, but one of the best definitions of social work in recent years has come from an organisation called the International Federation of Social Work. There are lots of very good definitions, but I think this one really goes to the heart of what social work should be about. And what you will see, and I dare say none of us will disagree with this, all of us subscribe to that definition of social work, because what it does is it puts our value base at the very heart of what we were about as a profession. But it also talks about social justice, it also talks about social cohesion, and fundamentally it talks about social change. And I believe that we need social change more than ever at the moment. What Swan is a campaigning group that involves lots of different constituent groups. This year we held our 11th Congress conference, and the problem we have with Swan at the moment is finding venues that are big enough to hold our conferences, because what we're seeing are mostly younger people who are studying social work or involved in social care, who are looking for answers. And I think one theme I've seen time and time again come up was that when I trained in social work, what used to happen is that we were very enthusiastic for our training, we were enthusiastic when we began life as social workers, and then in time, there was the potential to become jaded and to become more cynical. I think what we're seeing more and more actually is that process starting much, much earlier. That social work students, social workers in training, are asking searching questions. And I think that the previous speakers have addressed these issues perfectly. People are asking questions. We are teaching people to be critical in their thinking. In other words, to be analytical. Critical in the academic sense means more analytical. If we're teaching people to be analytical, we should not be surprised when they come back and ask us difficult questions. Because if we don't want to teach them critical thinking, or if we don't have the answers, then why are we asking them to think more critically about the world in which they live in? And I think one of the strengths of Swan is our ability to be able to talk about what's happening on the front line. So our journal, which is a quarterly journal, not only has contributions from academics, it also has articles and contributions from service users, from frontline practitioners. And I'd encourage any of you, if you have articles, if you've got something to say, send that to the Swan Network, and we will do our utmost to get that published so we can then begin a discussion. So it's really important that actually we listen to a number of different voices when we think about what social work is. And also, I guess, going back to what I was saying about social work's perspective, social work is in the radical tradition. Now, the radical tradition of social work is quite a small tradition, but nevertheless, it's a tradition which has always punched above its weight. It's a tradition actually that has put issues such as empowerment, social justice, anti-discriminatory practice, all those key values of what social work is all about. Radical social work has always put those issues on the agenda, and I would argue those are the non-negotiables. But also, I think we need to take stock of the world in which we live in, because I think if we don't do that, I think we are going to really struggle to see what's happening in social work. At the moment, we have a number of challenges. In fact, we have when we see partnerships, when we see consultations from government, whether it's under the coalition government, the Conservative government currently, or even under New Labour, they very much wanted to hear what social workers had to say, but it was very much on their terms. In fact, Terry Bamford, who wrote a member of BASWA, wrote a brilliant book a little while ago where he said, if you look at the Labour government from 1997 up to 2010, there was great opportunities there to champion social justice campaigns, to challenge social exclusion. But one thing was really noticeable, and that was social work was completely marginalised from the process. Here was an opportunity where government could have said, we want to change the world, we want to change society, we want to address inequality, we want to address poverty. The logic of that, I think, is what role can social work play in that? What constructive role can we play in that? And I think governments time and time again have overlooked us. And the risk, I think, is that we end up being a profession that is process-driven and that is dictated by our statutory responsibilities. And that begins to chip away at any analysis of where problems come from. But moreover, I think a recent development is it begins to challenge relationship-based social work. In other words, the very skills and theories and ideas we use in practice, which are based on counselling, psychological traditions, social sciences, that all begins to get chipped away. So I think it's really incumbent on us to have some answers to that. But also we've got some other examples. We've got the EU referendum, for example, and there's a number of things that have come out of that, and a number of surveys which have come out off the back of it. In fact, some surveys before the actual election were pointing to one thing, and that is that you are far more likely to vote for exit if you're poor. In fact, if you're poor, the Financial Times did a survey last week after the referendum, and it said if you're poor, if you're voting exit, you are far more likely to not trust academics, journalists, politicians. It goes on and has a whole list of basically what it sees as the establishment. And I think that we need to make sense of what's going on here, because I think that after 6 years of austerity, I think people have really had enough. And I think it's very difficult to talk about social work without talking about austerity, because austerity has seen millions of pounds taken out of welfare services and being directed elsewhere. That makes the lives of the people that we work with far more difficult, but it also makes our task as a social worker, of social workers, that much more difficult to do. So I think any analysis of what we do as social work needs to look at the fundamental issues of, do we have governments that are prepared to invest in society? Do we have governments that are prepared to invest in civic society? And it was summed up a couple of weeks ago by a Guardian journalist who said, unfortunately at this moment in time, we are being led by people who want to take everything out of society, but we want to put nothing back in again. That is the context in which we are doing social work at the moment. That's the challenge for us. And in terms of, I've talked about ideas being contested, but actually there's one idea which isn't contested, and that is the idea of inequality. In fact, I've not read any academic article which basically challenges the idea that society is becoming more unequal. In fact, government policy at the moment is to acknowledge that we live in a more unequal society. And some of you may be familiar with the work that's been done by Oxfam. Oxfam have been doing a number of surveys in recent years where they have basically said that although we're living in times of austerity, we are also living in a period where poorer people are paying for that austerity. In other words, austerity has become a choice rather than an economic philosophy. Yeah, the Oxfam report was very interesting. They did a survey in 2010 where they said that 388 people, or 388 of the richest people in the world have the same wealth as half the planet. Or in other words, 388 people in the world have the same wealth as 3.5 billion people. You could fit them all onto an aeroplane, yeah, a large aeroplane. Over the years, that number has dwindled. And in fact, last year they said you can now fit the 62 of the wealthiest people, so you can put them onto a coach now rather than an aeroplane. They're predicting that by 2020 you'll be able to put those people into a minibus. That one example for me tells us the direction of travel, where we're going, and what we need to do, I think, to make sense of that. There are lots of illustrations of this. Is probably one of my favourite illustrations. This was an interesting. I deliberately took these couple of illustrations because this was a definition of inequality which came from the Labour government, and this research influenced the Equality Act of 2010, a fantastic piece of legislation that basically put on statute that treating people unlawfully, treating people unequally was unlawful. And this was an acknowledgement from government. Although we have legislation, although we have policies which we work to, and I think the world's a better place because of them, nevertheless, we still have inequality. We still have communities that are being left behind. We still have people who are being left behind. And that's even with legislation being enshrined. But moreover, I think we've known this. I mean, there's two quotes from two professors of social work from England and Scotland. And what they argue, well, would you have a quick read of it? Can you read that okay? Yeah. What I think this produces is social injustice, the very opposite of what social work really is all about. And I think that we need to understand that we're far more likely to live in areas like Carlton, or work in areas like Carlton, than in Lensing. Or we're far more likely, I'm from London, so I know only too well as a social worker, I'll be far more likely to work in around the areas of St Pancras, what's called Somerstown, which is a borough of Camden. Far more likely to work in that area than in Hampstead. And I think we need to take stock of that. I think we need to make sense of what's happening in the world around us and how that is impacted on the very communities we're serving. So I think social work has always been a difficult profession. It's a very difficult thing to do, and it's a very difficult thing to do well. But I think that what we always need to be thinking about is looking at the big picture, looking at the totality. Because I think by looking at that, we can begin to make sense of what social work is all about. I've got some other slides here which I'm going to jump. I'll just quickly mention this one, because actually, before the implementation of austerity in 2010, we sort of knew what was going to happen. And in fact, you know, Lavalette and Ferguson in that same article talk about how this is going to impact on people, how we're going to see increased stress. And I think one thing we probably didn't anticipate is it's not just that it's people who are unemployed who are in poverty. In fact, the most recent research from a range of bodies is saying that in Britain at the moment there are 6 million people in work but in poverty. Absolutely unprecedented. We've never seen that before. So 6 million people go to work every day to earn their poverty, as Owen Jones said in the Guardian article a little while ago. And so we're increasingly working with people actually who are not disenfranchised, but people who are in work but are still in poverty, and with all the consequences that flow from that. So I think if we want to change that, I think what it means is we have to get active. And in fact, what history tells us is if we want to see change, we can't rely on people to do it for us. In fact, I've got very little confidence in politicians. In fact, I've always said that the average politician, if you put them in social work practice, they wouldn't last 5 minutes. Yet these are the very people that we're encouraged to look to give us the answers. I think if we want change, I think actually it's in our hands. I think we've got to go out, think as social workers about the bigger picture, not fall into a trap of stigmatising people or pathologising people and their problems, but actually looking at an alternative. And I'm going to finish on this one point. A student, I taught a session for our second year students who have just come back from their first placement last week, and I introduced them to an approach which many of you will be familiar with, which is the strengths approach, which is something I'm very passionate about. And it's simply that what we do is, rather than focusing on what people can't do, we look at people's potential. We look at what people can do. In other words, social work is always about hope, rather than feeding despair. It's always about believing in hope. Even in the most difficult circumstances, it's about believing that another world is possible, another social work is possible. And there are times when the people we work with will have absolutely no hope whatsoever because of their circumstances, because of the limited choices that they have. On those opportunities, I think we've got to be the ones who hold on to the hope and actually say, you can do this. There is an alternative. There is another way of thinking about this. And I think that one session, I think, gives people inspiration. That one session gives people inspiration because they're now going to be going back out to do their final placement. And I think if we don't give social workers hope, I think it's very easy for people to become jaded, to become pessimistic about change, and that completely clashes with what social work is all about. I'm just going to quickly, this was a banner that was produced for the first SWAN conference, and it's been adopted now as our main slogan. And that's simply that another social work is possible, that actually the social work we need, the social work we want, is the social work we have to campaign for and we have to fight for, and that's down to you. Thank you very much.